The full story, so far as deciphered, will shortly appear in an official bulletin of Miskatonic University. Again with the Miskatonic University. How many stories does he do that in? Mention that in. Here I shall sketch only the salient highlights in a formless, rambling way. Myth or otherwise, the sculptures told of the coming of those star-headed things to the nascent, lifeless earth out of cosmic space, their coming and the coming of many other alien entities, such as, at certain times, embark upon spatial pioneering. They seemed able to traverse the interstellar ether on their vast membranous wings, thus oddly confirming some curious hill folklore long ago told me by an antiquarian colleague. They had lived under the sea a good deal, building fantastic cities and fighting terrific battles with nameless adversaries by means of intricate devices employing unknown principles of energy. Evidently their scientific and mechanical knowledge far surpassed man's today, though they made use of its more widespread and elaborate forms only when obliged to. Some of the sculptures suggested that they had passed through a stage of mechanized life on other planets, but had receded upon finding its effects emotionally unsatisfying. Their preternatural toughness of organization and simplicity of natural wants made them peculiarly able to live on a high plane without the more specialized fruits of artificial manufacture, and even without garments except for occasional protection against the elements. It was under the sea at first for food, and later for other purposes, that they first created Earth-like life, using available substances according to long-known methods. The more elaborate experiments came after the annihilation of various cosmic enemies. They had done the same thing on other planets, having manufactured not only necessary foods, but certain multicellular protoplasmic masses capable of molding their tissues into all sorts of temporary organs under hypnotic influences, and thereby forming ideal slaves to perform the heavy work of the community. These vicious masses were, without doubt, what Abdul-Hazred whispered about as the Shoggoths in his frightful Necronomicon, though even that mad Arab had not hinted that any existed on earth except in dreams of those who had chewed a certain alkaloidal herb, when the star-headed old ones on this planet had synthesized their simple food forms and bred a good supply of Shoggoths. They allowed other cell groups to develop into other forms of animal and vegetable life for sundry purposes, extirpating any whose presence became troublesome. With the aid of the Shoggoths, whose expansions could be made to lift prodigious weights, the small low cities under the sea grew to vast and imposing labyrinths of stone not unlike those which latter rose on land. Indeed, the highly adaptable old ones had lived much on land in parts of the universe and probably retained much traditions of land construction. As we studied the architecture of all these sculptured Paleogean cities, including that whose ion-dead corridors we were even then traversing, we were impressed by a curious coincidence which we have not yet tried to explain even to ourselves. The tops of the buildings, which in the actual city around us had of course been weathered into shapeless ruins ages ago, were clearly displayed in the bas-reliefs and showed vast clusters of needle-like spires, delicate finials on certain cone and pyramid apexes, and tiers of thin, horizontal scalloped discs, cupping cylindrical shafts. This was exactly what we had seen in that monstrous and portentous mirage, cast by a dead city, whence such skyline features had been absent for thousands and tens of thousands of years, which loomed on our ignorant eyes across the unfathomed mountains of madness as we first approached poor lakes ill-fated camp. Of the life of the old ones, both under the sea and after part of them migrated to land, volumes could be written. Those in shallow water had continued the fullest use of the eyes at the ends of their 5 main head tentacles, and had practiced the arts of sculpture and writing in quite the usual way, the writing accomplished with a stylus on waterproof waxen surfaces. Those lower down in the ocean depths, though they used a curious phosphorescent organism to furnish light, pieced out their vision with obscure special senses operating through the prismatic cilia on their heads, senses which rendered all the old ones partially independent of light in emergencies. Their forms of sculpture and writing had changed curiously during the descent, embodying certain apparently chemical coating processes, probably to secure phosphorescence, which the bas-reliefs could not make clear to us. The beings moved in a sea partly by swimming, using the lateral crinoid arms, and partly by wriggling with the lower tier of tentacles containing the pseudo-feet. Occasionally they accomplished long swoops with the auxiliary use of 2 or more sets of their fan-like folding wings. On land they locally used the pseudo-feet, but now and then flew to great heights or over long distances with their wings, the many slender tentacles into which the crinoid arms branched were infinitely delicate, flexible, strong, and accurate in muscular nervous coordination, ensuring the utmost skill and dexterity in all artistic and other manual operations. The toughness of the things was almost incredible. Even the terrific pressures of the deepest sea bottoms appeared powerless to harm them. Very few seemed to die at all except by violence, and their burial places were very limited. The fact that they covered their vertically inhumed dead with 5-pointed inscribed mounds set up thoughts in Danforth and me, which made a fresh pause and recuperation necessary after the sculptures revealed it. The beings multiplied by means of spores like vegetable pterophytes. Pterophytes? As Lake had suspected, but owing to their prodigious toughness and longevity and consequent lack of replacement needs, they did not encourage the large-scale development of new Prathali, except when they had new regions to colonize. The young matured swiftly and received an education evidently beyond any standard we can imagine. The prevailing intellectual and aesthetic life was highly evolved, and produced a tenaciously enduring set of customs and institutions which I shall describe more fully in my coming monograph. These varied slightly according to sea or land residence, but had the same foundations and essentials. Though able, like vegetables, to derive nourishment from inorganic substances, they vastly preferred organic and especially animal food. They ate uncooked marine life under the sea, but cooked their viands on land. They hunted game and raised meat herds, slaughtering with sheep weapons whose odd marks on certain fossil bones our expedition had noticed. They resisted all ordinary temperatures marvelously, and in their natural state could live in water down to freezing. When the great chill of the Pleistocene drew on, however, nearly 1,000,000 years ago, the land dwellers had to resort to special measures, including artificial heating, until, at last, the deadly cold appears to have driven them back into the sea. For their prehistoric flights through cosmic space, legend said, they had absorbed certain chemicals and became almost independent of eating, breathing, or heat conditions. By the time of the Great Cold, they had lost track of the method. In any case, they could not have prolonged the artificial state indefinitely without harm. Being non-pairing and semi vegetable in structure, the Old Ones had no biological basis for the family phase of mammal life, but seemed to organize large households on the principles of comfortable space utility, and as we have deduced from the pictured occupations and diversions of co-dwellers, congenial mental association in furnishing their homes, they kept everything in the center of the huge rooms, leaving all the wall spaces free for decorative treatment. Lighting, in the case of the land inhabitants, was accomplished by a device probably electrochemical in nature, both on the land and underwater. They used curious tables, chairs, and couches like cylindrical frames, where they rested and slept upright, with folded down tentacles, and racks for the hinged sets of dotted surfaces forming their books. So, sort of like Braille or something. Government was evidently complex and probably socialistic, though no certainties in this regard could be deduced from the sculptures we saw. There was extensive commerce, both local and between different cities, certain small flat counters, five-pointed and inscribed, serving as money. Probably the smaller of the various greenish soapstones found by our expedition were pieces of such currency, though the culture was mainly urban. Some agriculture and much stock raising existed. Mining and a limited amount of manufacturing were also practiced. Travel was very frequent, but permanent migration seemed relatively rare, except for the vast colonizing movements by which the race expanded. For personal locomotion, no external aid was used, since in land, air, and water movement alike, the Old Ones seemed to possess exclusively vast capacities for speed. Loads, however, were drawn by beasts of burden, Shoggoths under the sea, and a curious variety of primitive vertebrates in the latter years of land existence. These vertebrates, as well as an infinity of other life forms, animal and vegetable, marine, terrestrial, and aerial, were the products of unguided evolution, acting on life cells made by the Old Ones, but escaping beyond the radius of attention. They had been suffered to develop unchecked because they had not come in conflict with the dominant beings. Bothersome forms, of course, were mechanically exterminated. It interested us to see in some of the very last and most decadent sculptures a shambling primitive mammal, used sometimes for food and sometimes as amusing buffoon by the land dwellers, whose vague simian and human foreshadowings were unmistakable. In the building of land cities, the huge stone blocks of the high towers were generally lifted by vast winged pterodactyls of species heretofore unknown to paleontology. The persistence with which the Old Ones survived various geologic changes and convulsions of the Earth's crust was a little short of miraculous, though few or none of the first cities seem to have remained beyond the Archaean age. There was no interruption in their civilization or in the transmission of their records. Their original place of advent to the planet was the Antarctic Ocean, and it is likely that they came not long after the matter forming the moon was wrenched from the neighboring South Pacific. According to one of the sculptured maps, the whole globe was then under water, with stone cities scattered farther and farther from the Antarctic as ions passed. Another map shows the vast bulk of dry land around the South Pole, where it is evident that some of the beings made experimental settlements through their main centers were transferred to the nearest sea bottom. Latter maps, which display this landmass as cracking and drifting and sending certain detached parts northward, uphold in a striking way the theories of continental drift lately advanced by Taylor, Wegener, and Jolly. With the upheaval of new land in the South Pacific, tremendous events began. Some of the marine cities were hopelessly shattered. Yet that was not the worst misfortune. Another race, a land race of beings shaped like octopi, and probably corresponding to the fabulous pre-human spawn of Cthulhu, soon began filtering down from cosmic infinity, precipitated a monstrous war which for a time drove the Old Ones wholly back to the sea, a colossal blow in view of the increasing land settlements. Latter peace was made, and the new lands were given to the Cthulhu spawn, whilst the old ones held the sea and the older lands. New land cities were founded, the greatest of them in the Antarctic, for this region of first arrival was sacred. From then on, as before, the Antarctic remained the center of the Old One's civilization, and all the discoverable cities built there by the Cthulhu spawn were blotted out. Then, suddenly, the lands of the Pacific sank again, taking with them the frightful stone city of R'lyeh and all the cosmic octopi, so that the old ones were again supreme on the planet, except for one shadowy fear, about which they did not like to speak. At a rather later age, their cities dotted all the land and water areas of the globe. Hence the recommendation in my coming monograph that some archaeologists make systematic borings with Peabody's type of apparatus in certain widely separated regions. The steady trend down the ages was from water to land, a movement encouraged by the rise of new land masses. Though the ocean was never wholly deserted, another cause of the landward movement was the new difficulty in breeding and managing the Shoggoths, upon which successful sea life depended. With the march of time, as the sculptors sadly confessed, the art of creating new life from inorganic matter had been lost, so that the old ones had to depend on the molding of forms already in existence. On land, the great reptiles proved highly tractable, but the Shoggoths of the sea, reproducing by fission and acquiring a dangerous degree of accidental intelligence, presented for a time a formidable problem. It had always been controlled through the hypnotic suggestion of the old ones, and had modeled their tough plasticity into various useful temporary limbs and organs. But now their self-modeling powers were sometimes exercised independently and in various imitative forms implanted by past suggestion. They had, it seemed, developed a semi-stable brain whose separate and occasional stubborn volition echoed the will of the old ones without always obeying it. Sculptured images of these Shoggoths filled Danforth and me with horror and loathing. They were normally shapeless entities composed of a viscous jelly, which looked like a aggregation of bubbles, and each averaged about 15 feet in diameter when a sphere. They had, however, a constantly shifting shape and volume, throwing out temporary developments, or forming apparent organs of sight, hearing, and speech, in imitation of their masters, either spontaneously or according to their suggestion. They seem to have become peculiarly intractable toward the middle of the Permian Age, perhaps 150 million years ago, when a veritable war of re-subjugation was waged upon them by the marine old ones. Pictures of this war and of the headless, slime-coated fashion in which the Shoggoths typically left their slain victims held a marvelously fearsome quality despite the intervening abyss of untold ages. The old ones had used curious weapons of molecular disturbance against the rebel entities, and in the end had achieved a complete victory. Thereafter, the sculptures shewed a period in which the Shoggoths were tamed and broken by armed old ones, as the wild horses of the American West were tamed by cowboys. Though, during the rebellion, the Shoggoths had shewn an ability to live out of water, this transition was not encouraged, since their usefulness on land would hardly have been commensurate with the trouble of their management. During the Jurassic Age, the old ones met fresh adversary in the form of a new invasion from outer space, this time by half fungus, half crustacean creatures from a planet identifiable as the remote and recent recently discovered Pluto, creatures undoubtedly the same as those figuring in certain whispered hill legends of the north, and remembered in the Himalayas as the Mi-go, or abominable snowmen. To fight these beings, the Old Ones attempted for the first time since their terrene advent to sally forth again into the planetary aether, but despite all traditional preparations found it no longer possible to leave the Earth's atmosphere. Whatever the old secret of interstellar travel had been, it was now definitely lost to the race. In the end, the Mi-go drove the Old Ones out of all the northern lands, though they were powerless to disturb those in the sea. Little by little, the slow retreat of the elder race to their original Antarctic habitat was beginning. It was curious to note from the pictured battles that both the Cthulhu spawn and the Mi-go seemed to have been composed of matter more widely different from that which we know than was the substance of the Old Ones. They were able to undergo transformations and reintegrations impossible for their adversaries, and seem therefore to have originally come from even remoter gulfs of cosmic space. The Old Ones, but for their abnormal toughness and peculiar vital properties, were strictly material, and must have had their absolute origin within the known space-time continuum, whereas the first sources of the other beings can only be guessed at with bated breath. All this, of course, assuming that the non-terrestrial linkages and the abnormalities ascribed to the invading foes are not pure mythology. Conceivably, the Old Ones might have invented a cosmic framework to account for their occasional defeats, since historic interest and pride obviously form their chief psychological element. It is significant that their annals fail to mention many advanced and potent races of beings whose mighty cultures and towering cities figure persistently in certain obscure legends. Now, it's important to realize that sometimes what's being talked about in the myths is not physical. The changing state of the world through long geologic ages appeared with startling vividness in many of the sculptured maps and scenes. Certain cases existing science will require revision, while in other cases its bold deductions are magnificently confirmed. As I have said, the hypothesis of Taylor, Wegener, and Jolly, that all the continents are fragments of an original Antarctic mass, which cracked from centrifugal force and drifted apart over a technically viscous lower surface, an hypothesis suggested by such things as complementary outlines of Africa and South America, and the way the great mountain chains are rolled and shoved up, receives striking support from this uncanny source. And there are mythologies that talk about plate tectonics in some way or another. Maps evidently showing the Carboniferous world of 100 million or more years ago displayed significant rifts and chasms, destined later to separate Africa from the once continuous realms of Europe, then the Pelusia of hellish primal legend. Asia, the Americas, and the Antarctic continent. Other charts, and most significantly, one in connection with the founding 50 million years ago of the vast dead city around us, shewed all the present continents well differentiated, and in the latest discoverable specimen, dating perhaps from the Pleistocene age, the approximate world of today appeared quite clearly despite the linkage of Alaska with Siberia, of North America with Europe through Greenland, and of South America with the Antarctic continent through Graham Land. In the Carboniferous map, The whole globe, ocean floor and rifted landmass alike, bore symbols of the old ones, vast stone cities. But in the latter charts, the gradual recession toward the Antarctic became very plain. The final Pliocene specimen showed no land cities except on the Antarctic continent and the tip of South America, nor any ocean cities north of the 50th parallel of south latitude. Knowledge and interest in the northern world, save for a study of coastlines probably made during long exploration flights on those fan-like membranous wings, had evidently declined to zero among the old ones. Destruction of cities through the upthrust of mountains, the centrifugal rending of continents, the seismic convulsions of land or sea bottom, the other natural causes was a matter of common record, and it was curious to observe how fewer and fewer replacements were made as the ages wore on. The vast dead megalopolis that yawned around us seemed to be the last general center of the race. Built early in the Cretaceous age, after titanic earth buckling had obliterated a still vaster predecessor not far distant. It appeared that this general region was the most sacred spot of all, where, reputedly, the first old ones had settled on a primal sea bottom, in the new city many of whose features we could recognize in the sculptures, but which stretched fully 100 miles along the mountain range in each direction beyond the farthest limits of our aerial survey. There were, reputed to be preserved, certain sacred stones forming part of the first sea bottom city, which were thrust up to light after long epochs in the course of the general crumpling of strata.